Welcome, everyone. So good to see all of you here in person, many others joining us via Zoom. Welcome to you all. If you haven't been to campus before, or if you're unfamiliar with our mission at United, United prepares innovative and compassionate leaders for the equipping of churches, other faith communities, and society toward justice and peace. And I don't think I said my name is Dean Kyle Roberts, so if you haven't met me before, we haven't met. I look forward to hopefully meeting you at some point. Tonight, we welcome you to the Susan Draper White Lecture, founded in 1992 and named for the grandmother of alum Reverend Syl Braun. One of our earliest contributors to women's studies at United was Dr. Gail Graham Yates. Dr. Yates taught a course on women and the church in the spring of 1973. Gail is not present tonight, but we dedicate this evening to her investments in this work. I did see Wilson Yates, Dr. Wilson Yates, the esteemed, yeah, that's right, is here with us tonight, so greetings. As we thought about what to do for the Susan Draper White Lecture this year, it seemed appropriate to reflect on the influence of feminist theology over 60 years at United. Here's a fun fact. In 1973, 30% of the students at United identified as female. This number was higher than any other ATS seminary at the time. And to put that into context further, that was 2 years after Ms. Magazine was first published.
Oh my.
3 years later, in 1976, United had 50% of our students identified as female. I don't know if that's causative or correlative between the Ms. Magazine being published. It is important to note that there are many others who made significant contributions to this work at United who are not on the panel this evening. We think of Reverend Dr. Karen Smith-Sellers, Reverend Dr. Christine Smith, and Reverend Dr. Christy Neuger, and many more. Tonight's panelists all have significant resumes and are known for their writing and teaching in this area. But for tonight, let me just introduce them in a context that connects to our theme. Dr. Mary Potter, joining us via Zoom, taught at United from 1983 to 1991. Mary says that if it hadn't been for women's studies and feminism, she might have never come to UTS. Shortly after she arrived, she taught an elective course on feminist theology. This was one of the many courses that focused on women's experience in feminist theology or integrated them as essential elements of a class content. Dr. Mary Farrell Bednarowski joined the faculty in 1976. Her contributions to the development of women's studies at United were many, including the fact that she was the first chair of the women's studies faculty. Mary's work in this area went beyond the classroom in many ways, including giving the opening keynote, The Spirit of Reimagining, at the first Reimagining Conference in 1993. Reverend Dr. Carolyn Pressler joined the faculty in 1990. Carolyn's interpretation of the Bible through a feminist lens opened new understandings of Scripture for her students and colleagues alike. In later years, Carolyn co-taught a course on interpretation as resistance, womanist, feminist, and queer approaches to the Bible with Reverend Dr. Alika Galloway. This was an important development in expanding the conversation at United. Reverend Dr. Barbara Anne Keely arrived in 1991 and played a key role in the planning committee for Reimagining. As a professor and mentor, Barbara Ann helped students understand how feminist theology might inform the work that our students did as church leaders. Dr. Jennifer Awes Freeman brings the stories of women from the medieval times alive, which is weird when they become alive. Regularly teaching a course entitled Medieval Women Mystics. She was also key in bringing the Beyonce Mass to the Twin Cities just a year or so ago. Reverend Dr. Jessica Chapman Lape is a womanist pastoral theologian, a clinically trained chaplain, and a community-trained doula. Jessica is committed to advancing the field of pastoral theology in order to address and interrupt Black women's mistreatment in U.S. healthcare. Jessica is currently teaching a course, and I think will join us later on in the evening. Last but not least, as they say, Reverend Dr. Molly T. Marshall, president of United Seminary, will be our moderator for the evening. Molly says her sense of calling to ministry led her in the early 1970s to be a feminist interpreter of scripture and church history, as she grew in the knowledge that spiritual gifts are not given according to gender, but as the Spirit disposes. She began to unhinge her understanding of vocation from patriarchal structures. And we praise God for that, Molly. And for you being here with us at United. Thank you all for being here, and now I will turn it over to President Molly Marshall.
Thank you, Dean Roberts. Gratefully so. You are blessed among women tonight. Let me add my welcome. So grateful that all of you are here and those who join us on Zoom as well. It's just grand to have this gathering. Now, just a little bitty bit of context. Scholars of feminist theology or feminism talk about waves. First, second, third, fourth waves. First wave would be suffragettes, or Jennifer might disagree with that, but in terms of how we are giving a schedule, at least a chronology, in the U.S. That would be the 19th, the early 20th century. When we think of folk like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, who in 1851 did Ain't I a Woman speech, a forebearer in many respects. The second wave, we usually think of beginning in the 60s. And that's where people are concerned about social inequality between the genders. A lot of political things were going on during that time. Actually, we kind of bridge stage 2 and 3 here tonight, as well as 4, when Jessica and Jennifer add their voices. The third wave, usually we think of in the early 90s, and so the Reimagining Conference fits squarely in that. And that's where people are concerned about globalization, post-colonialism, and the beginnings of intersectionality. But then in 2012, we begin to talk about the fourth wave of feminism. And there, it's much more focused on what are the gender norms and what needs to be interrogated, and how do we construct identity, taking into account the various identities that constitute humanity. Well, we don't have anybody of the first, well, maybe I'd qualify, the first round. Mary B., you and I might qualify for the first round of feminism. Oh,
Far too young.
Too young. But tonight, as we think about the wonderful influence of feminist theology at United, you see how these epochs kind of flow in together, build upon one another and a continuing stream. So let's start with some questions, and this will be fun. What do you think it was about United that drew so many gifted feminist theologians? Was it a culture that attracted you, or was it a culture that you created together?
Yes. Am I going to start this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Because I have a little list here. And I would say that I came to United because it was the thrill of my lifetime to be hired by United. And that was kind of an accident, and it was the gift of Gail Graham Yates. Gail was leaving United to become the director of women's studies at the University of Minnesota, and Tom Campbell, the dean, said, "Do you know anybody who can teach that course you've been teaching on women in American religious history?" And Gail said, "Yeah, my friend Mary can do that, and she's moving back from Milwaukee." So I had an interview with Tom Campbell, and we talked about whether it would matter that I was a Catholic, and we decided no, that didn't matter. That would be okay. I would be diversity. That would work. And he said, while you're at it, Gail directs the MA program, the MA in Religious Studies, the Mars program. Would you want to do that too? And I said, sure. I'm not sure I even knew what religious studies was at that time, but I learned. And I mention that only because I want to emphasize how open United was to some kind of unusual people, and I was one of those at the time. So what kind of place did I walk into? There were already women on the faculty. Pat Wilson-Kastner was here teaching historical theology, Karen Smith-Sellers. There were increasing numbers, as you heard from Kyle, of women students, and a growing number of women clergy in the Twin Cities who had their degrees from United. So there was a sense already that this was a good place for women. There was a gender-inclusive language policy in place, I think since 1972, but it was well established by the time I arrived. There was a student caucus that met with the faculty, and a group that included several faculty wives, and at the time they were wives. Most of them. I'm going to make this too complicated, and then Molly will get the hook, and I will. Okay, I'm not going to qualify every single sentence that I utter here. So, who went to the faculty to, as Clyde said, make suggestions about feminist theology and later sexual identities and issues. There was a desire for someone to teach a course, as I mentioned, and so I knew that not only could I teach the course, I had to teach the course. And that was kind of a nice blend of obligation and opportunity, I would say. The new degree program, the Mars program, drew a lot of women. There was a curriculum in place based on the assumption of a dynamic relationship between theology and culture. Christ transforming culture. I learned about the Niebers in a very big hurry when I got here. I think it fostered, I know it fostered, an openness to new issues of social justice and to new ways of doing theology. In the latest issue of Voices, Clyde, I saw you. Where are you? There you are. In the latest issue of Voices, there's an essay about Clyde, a lovely essay, in which he said, we didn't try to find the answer. We tried to respond as the times went on. And I think that's a very powerful thing to say about a theological seminary. There was a willingness and an encouragement to take risks on controversial topics, and not only feminism. The year I arrived, Jim Nelson was on sabbatical writing embodiment. So there was just, we weren't afraid to tackle things, issues that we cared about that might be controversial in other places. Many members of the male faculty, the non-women on the faculty, were and had been involved in the civil rights movement and in other issues like protesting cluster bombs and Honeywell. And there's a famous photo some of you may have seen. I think it was Wilson and Clyde and Jim Nelson. Was it Clyde smoking a big cigar? I will not go into the symbolism of that. I'm too shy and modest, but it's a lovely photo if you could find it. It's got to be around somewhere. I don't know where Cindy Beth is, but I bet she has that photo. There were no fears that I experienced about interdisciplinary work. We crossed boundaries. So feminist issues could turn up in any classes, and they did. That was true of the arts as well. I mean, I will not pursue that. You get what I mean. People weren't saying, that's my territory. You can't teach that in this class. There just was none of that I experienced. There was an emphasis on story, on human experience. It was so much a part of early feminism and ongoing feminism, and that emphasis was already in place here. And not just your individual story, but the story of your spiritual journey, the histories you had been a part of, economic history, labor history, immigration history, women's history, theological history, church history. Anything was pretty much fair game for articulating in a story that you constructed and deconstructed and reconstructed and then joined with other stories. And I think that was very conducive to feminist method. And here's the last point. There was an obvious commitment to be kind to strangers. And I was a stranger in a strange land. I can't tell you how little I knew about liberal Protestant theological seminaries. And I felt totally at home. I was bewildered some of the time. Dayton Hultgren, the president at the time, said to my husband one time, I'm so glad Mary feels that she can ask risking questions. And I thought, risking questions? I wonder, whoa, which ones those were, since I was not aware of what they were. I felt that at ease with my colleagues. And there was a high tolerance for studying whatever you wanted to study. I was studying new religions, and nobody said that's too weird to study. I see a nonverbal bit of communication. I'm through. Goodbye.
For now,
Yeah,
Mary.
yeah.
I want to turn to Mary Potter. Mary, who was professor of historical theology here. Kyle, did you introduce Dr. Potter? I thought so.
Sorry,
Dr. Pressler
my
here
mind
wasn't
blanked.
so sure, and so wanted not to neglect you, Mary. Would you respond to the second part of this question, Mary? Was it a culture that attracted you to come to United in the first place?
Yes, that's all I need to say. I had my eye on UTS for a while as a liberal, progressive, social justice oriented seminary, which was in stark contrast to the two other seminaries, which were conservative and Bardian, where I had previously taught. So when I moved to the Twin Cities in '81, I attended, like a spy, one of Jim Nelson's workshops on theology and sexuality in a downtown church to say, are these people really as good as, they say they are in their catalog? And then reading the catalog, I saw that to my dismay, they already had a woman, Pat Wilson Kastner, who taught exactly what I taught, historical and constructive theology. They had hired her in 1975. So, I mean, that was wonderful. She had written 2 articles by that point on differentiating revolutionary feminism from reformist feminism and so forth. But I thought, okay, no chance for me. I'll look from afar and just, salivate over the seminary where I can't teach. And then to my surprise, in 1982, when I was teaching at Luther Northwestern Seminary, which it was called at the time, Pat Wilson Kastner left for the Episcopal Seminary. Yeah. And so I applied, and I was even more surprised when my first interview was an informal interview by Mary Bednarowski at Muffaletta's, a restaurant across from the Lutheran Seminary. And I was expecting a theological grilling like I'd had at Princeton and at Luther. And instead, we had this marvelous conversation about Kate Chopin's Awakening and about Sarah Orne Jewett's The Country of the Pointed Firs. And I knew she taught then in the Mars program. And I thought, oh, this was a revelation that a seminary could not be siloed in tradition, but could be open like this. And then in my formal interview, one of them, I was further surprised by one of the students who interviewed me was an Ojibwe woman, part of the Native American Theological Association program. And she asked me a very important question. How did I think my style of teaching would affect her and the people in her community? And I was just so happy at this question because I thought, okay, not only do they talk about sexuality in women, but they're also open to marginalized communities. And so I thought, I'm going to sign me up right now. And my inaugural lecture was titled after Virginia Woolf, In the Procession of the Sons of Educated Men. And I didn't wear my little beret as a kind of resistance to the authority of the patriarchal tradition. And I thought, and I was still welcomed. And that said everything to me, that I was welcomed as a feminist, willing to make some kind of funny gestures, and I never looked back. And I think I still say UTS was one of the most feminist institutions where I've ever taught. I even chaired faculty meetings with an infant at my breast. Where else can you do that, at that time? Anyway, so yes, I came because it was a place where I could be welcomed, and there were many, many conversations going on that I was very interested in.
Thanks so much. Carolyn, let me turn to you if you want to respond on this.
Yes, and my answer to the question, was it a culture that attracted you, or did you create the culture together, is yes, of course, yes. Mary B. and Mary Potter, whom we called Little Mary and Big Mary, because of seniority questions. We also called Mary B. Mother General, and that's for obvious reasons.
I like that.
They were here, Marilyn Solomon was here, Helen Archibald was here, so I was woman number 5 on a faculty of 12. We weren't quite half, but we were a significant number. And I was going to say this later, but I will tell you, my dissertation director, a feminist, one of the mothers in biblical interpretation, Catherine Dube Sackenfeld, had told me a year before, when she had kind of wanted me to apply for a position at Yale, which I didn't apply to, she had said to me, but I don't really want you in that cutthroat environment. I'd like you to be at a place like my friend Mary Potter Engel at the time is at. I'd like you to be at a place like United. And so I was at Princeton hearing about United and knowing it was a place where people with my commitments were not marginalized, but were actually kind of at the center of things. And I very much I very much wanted to be here. When I didn't get the call from Wilson Yates the evening he was supposed to call, I cried all night. And then he called the next morning apologizing because he had miswritten my phone number. So I was so happy. I think part of the culture was indeed the kind, for me it was that Mary Potter and Mary Bednarowski and Marilyn were already here, but it was also that the men were so wanting us to be here. They weren't necessarily always wanting the ideas we came up with, and that continued to be true even towards the end of my tenure here when I would walk in the dean's office with social justice concerns. But they really were themselves activist faculty, activist scholars. I don't know if you know that, I hope you don't mind, Wilson, but Wilson was the first white guy arrested in Missouri in the Freedom Riders, right? In the Civil Rights Movement? In Tennessee. Okay, he corrects me. But this is the kind of, and I know that Clyde, he told me they hated this one particular elevator because that's where you could get beat up when you did civil rights action. They were people who cared about justice with everything in them. Now, that doesn't mean they were perfect. We used a lot of humor in the early days to make our way and to make it non-threatening. We had bright pink hats with lightning bolts on them and bright pink shirts that on the back said Feminix. So we used humor, and that was part of the culture we created, is we didn't want it to be us versus them, right? We wanted it to be fun. Mother General in particular, I think of Emma Goldman, and if I can't dance, I'm not going to be part of your revolution. She kept things full of laughter. But we created a culture together, and at the next question, I'll have some things to say about what I learned from individuals that helped make that culture.
Why don't you just go right ahead?
Okay, I was to say, how were we influenced by each other's work? And I would say I could probably go down the list of all. We met once a week over lunch, once a month over lunch, and had our women's studies meeting on the day that other meetings were taking place at the seminary on the Wednesday. And we would do what I would call serious check-in for about 45 minutes, and then we would do all our business in about 5. And I could go down the list of all the women who were in that group, whether it's Sharon Tan or Marilyn Salmon or whoever, and say something I learned from them. Christy Nuger influenced my work tremendously. I read her dissertation early, and it had to do with the importance of imagination as that which imaging gathers together both affect and intellect, reason and feelings, and that made a huge difference to how I taught, so that I quite explicitly taught Hebrew Bible. How will this, not just a source of data and dogma and things to feed your reason, but also something that influences your imagination. And that's probably more important once you get out and are interpreting it. So that's a huge influence on me. Mary Potter and Marilyn Salmon taught me to be very, very opened my eyes, really, to Christian feminist anti-Semitism, and taught me to think about, was this actual, or is this an attempt to make Jesus look good by critiquing in unfair ways the Jewish culture from which he emerged? Marilyn wrote a book called Preaching Without Contempt that was groundbreaking. I commend it even now, decades later, and it made a huge difference. Barbara Anne Keely asks the question always, so what difference does this make for the community of faith? And if it doesn't play in the congregation, why are you talking about it? And Mary Bednarowski, the laughter was so important and taught me it was okay to get my students laughing, and that wasn't the least bit contradictory to being a serious feminist. And it let me be more who I was in the classroom, and for that I will always be grateful. The other thing you taught me, Mary, was the that there had been all kinds of women theologians through the history of the church who came up, who made an impression, and who were forgotten. And so that I learned not to take for granted the strides that we were making, which in light of the Supreme Court's recent decision seems like a very good thing to have learned.
It's kind of a depressing thing that you learn when you study women's history. It's hard to know whether to be euphoric because you found someone 400 years ago saying exactly what women were saying now, or have a breakdown over it. But that's history.
You can see why she taught us to laugh and why she's our Mother General. I want to say, though, that besides what I learned from individuals, it was the creation of a culture which had already been invited by the male faculty as women began coming, but which most of us had come from conservative institutions. The only thing offered at the seminary where I did my MDiv was Karl Barth. I was blessed to have a feminist for my dissertation director at Princeton, but still I was considered so radical that they weren't sure they were ever going to let me graduate. And then when I came here, I was considered conservative. It was wonderful. There was a group, hi Jessica, there was a group of us and we were safe. We had not been free to express our ideas and to push them and to explore in the places we had been before, or it took a great deal of nerve. And then we came here and we could kind of take for granted. And that allowed us to push our scholarship places we couldn't have done otherwise. Now, I have to admit, and I'm going to say this even though it isn't something I'm happy about, there was a downside to that, at least for me. And that is that freedom, that safety was so precious that it was very, very hard for me to have the kind of open curiosity, why do you think that? With colleagues who were not feminist or womanist or mujerista. And I think I had a tendency, and maybe we did, to sideline some people because we were so, it was so freeing and so important to finally have a place where we could be at home. So if I have a regret, that would be one of the regrets. But in general, I'm glad I landed here. Sorry.
It's all right. This is a harder task than I signed on for tonight. Y'all are great. Because I want to talk too, yes. I'm going to move us ahead a little bit toward the pedagogical questions. And so I'll start here with Barbara Ann and then go to Mary Potter. And here's the question.
You flip that because she was here first.
All right. Then let's have Mary P. first, and then Barbara Ann. And the question is, how did women's studies and feminist theology influence which classes were taught, the way they were taught, how persons participated in those classes, and the way that the curriculum was built? So, off to you, Mary P.
Well, pedagogy is very, very important to women's studies and feminism, womanist theology, mujeristic theology. And I took the words of Audre Lorde. I actually put them in the class catalog because I thought they are so important. And this is what Audre Lorde says, that teaching is not filling empty vessels with content, it's inciting a riot. And that is, to me, that was feminist pedagogy, womanist pedagogy. And so the question was, what would learning look like if it wasn't the Herr Dr. Professor, standing up and everybody standing up before him? What would pedagogy look like? So let me just indulge me. I'm just going to talk about a few of the courses that I taught. I taught elective courses, and then I want to talk briefly about the two required courses. Pedagogically, we had a elective feminist theology class. I don't know if it was the first theology class at United. I don't know about that, but we read Oh, we read everything. It should have been titled Feminist Theologies. And what was happening at that time is very important, that there was an essentialist movement going on. People were writing books about woman, WOMAN, and not women. And criticism was starting to build about the whiteness, the imperialism, the dominant Christian assumptions, the Western assumptions of so-called feminist theology was treated as a monolith. And so the criticism came from Black women, womanist theologians, like of the Judy Chicago art installation. It traded in racist stereotypes. So that was going on. The anti-Semitism in the Christian feminist movement that Carolyn just referenced was part of it. That women from Africa and Southeast Asia and South America were saying, hey, this is your experience, it's not our experience. So all of that was going on. And we joined that conversation in that class. We were trying to figure out, it was a heady time. We were trying to figure out, what does woman mean? What does women's experience mean? What's a womanist theological approach? So that was an elective class. Then Valerie DeMarinis, we should not forget Valerie. Valerie DeMarinis and I taught an elective course on women and spirituality, in which we used, here's an influence, I think of it as Mary Bednarowski's model. We took women's experiences and we tried to draw from them, elicit from them, recurring themes about what was going on in women's lives, women who had all different kinds of experiences. And we read Native American women, Black women, a lot of wild things actually went on in that class. And I think that was when we invited, what was her name? Let me see, Ignatia Broker, an Ojibwe woman who had written a memoir called, or a novel called Night Flying Woman. And she came and spoke in the chapel as part of that. And then I taught an elective class on theological perspectives on sexual and domestic violence. I would never have dared to teach that class without two colleagues, two ethicists, feminist ethicists, Mary Pellauer and Lois Livesey, who had taught it as an adjunct course at McCormick Seminary in Chicago before. And this is the interesting thing pedagogically about that course. I went to Clyde, who was dean at the time, and said, I believe this class should be women only. And Clyde and I had a long conversation about this because of liberal education, open access, the need to train all, people who are going to be in leadership positions on this issue, and to protect the safety and the vulnerability of people, women who had experienced this kind of abuse. At that time, we didn't know about the epidemic of young boys and men. And Clyde and I together agreed that we would do that. So we ran that class as a women-only class. I don't know that any other dean or seminary would have allowed me to do that. Which brings me to the last thing I want to say, is that we were very aware as women in seminaries of being marginalized. Like, oh, you teach that elective course, people don't have to sign up for it. But we were training people to go out and be leaders in religious communities, in churches, in synagogues, in some cases. And my view was we needed to integrate and incorporate women's experiences all along the way in the required courses for that reason. So nobody could leave seminary without having this as part of their education. So I taught constructive theology and I taught the history of Christian communities. And in both of those classes, I incorporated all along the way, whether it was neo-Orthodox theology, we read women. If it was liberation, we read women. If it was Tillichian or process, we read women as well. And in the history of Christian communities, we looked at what was happening with women in the Christian communities, and to Jews and to homosexuals, as they were called then, in those Christian communities all along the way. So to me, that was a very important of the pedagogy, to do women focused or women's experience focused, and also to say Nobody gets out of here without really looking at these issues very, very deeply. So,
Thank you. Barbara Ann?
So it says on that piece of paper what my job title was, but that was only the last 6 years. For 18 years, I was Christian education and congregational spirituality, and with me, you get an educator's perspective. So that's how I want to approach this question. I'm probably not going to say anything you don't already inherently know, but there are 3 different ways of approaching teaching information. One is to say, here's the information that people need to know, and you focus just on the information. The second is, I'm the teacher, and I know what you need to know, so just open your head and I'll dump it in, and if you don't get it, that's your problem, but I've taught you. The third is learner-centered. Welcome to United. It was an evident focus at United when I started looking in the catalog. How did I get here? God only knows, except 2 things happened in 1991. I was completing my doctoral work in Richmond, Virginia at the Presbyterian School of Christian Education, and had been told that people don't hire people who have their doctorates from a school of education because you don't have a real PhD. But I did my dissertation on Letty Russell, and that intrigued people because Letty was a forefront not only in feminist work, but was one of the first women ordained in the Presbyterian Church in the late 50s. So that gave me an entree. But then what happened is that we had this conversation going on in the denomination around ordination of gays and lesbians, and this report came, the majority report, saying, yes, we should do it. And we should do it based on a book written by this ethicist named Jim Nelson, who taught at the seminary up in Minnesota. So here I am, this kid from the Pacific Northwest trying to survive in Richmond, Virginia, standing on the floor of Presbytery, quoting this man I had never met before, why we needed to stand up. To make a long story short, they accepted the minority report, and it didn't pass until years later. But within weeks of that, there's this job posting at United Seminary. So I applied, and Dean Yates called me and said, why don't you come up and tell us what you're working on and what you would like to teach? And I came, and it snowed the first week of April, and I went back to Richmond where my daffodils were in bloom, and I still signed my contracts on April Fool's Day. Because I read the catalog. And I read what was important to the school. And everything that said what's important to the school is people who come to work with us and want to learn and how to serve the church in its broadest form, in parishes, in chaplaincies, in other ways. And that's what I was ordained to do. So there was an evident focus. Most faculty here at United that I encountered intentionally considered our students when they started thinking about what courses do we need to offer? Who's walked in my door? What interesting conversation have I had with a student? What area am I teaching in that a student, maybe 2 students, maybe 3 students have said, shoot, I wish you had a course like that. And so directed studies would merge and become offered courses because faculty were listening to the students who were here that year and had that interest. So also what was included in core courses, we had a lot of conversations. I got myself out into those conversations early in my entrance here, thanks to Dean Yates and then later Dean Weiss, talking with our denominations. What do people need to know to serve in your congregations? And what became clearest through the years to me was how the attention of the students within our academic community began to impact more than just, oh, maybe we should teach that subject. But there were people like Carolyn and Christy and others who really started to listen. And then at these lunch meetings on Wednesdays that Carolyn mentioned, they would say, you know, I've had 3 African American women look at me and say, so why are we only reading white men? And, or what are you not telling us that we need to know? And those kinds of questions started to permeate because we're learner-centered. So how we engaged students began to expand, and the faculty among ourselves started to say, okay, we need to be intentional. And I remember, Carolyn, long conversations about deciding we would require books within courses that were of different backgrounds than who the teacher was. And which is how Carolyn, of course, ends up being really radical and inviting an African American feminist to come in and co-teach with her, to take it out of just being a white class, white woman's class. But we started listening, we'd been listening to gay, lesbian, I remember conversations in faculty meetings when transgender students and other students came and said, we don't define ourselves that way, and how do we invite them in, and how do we say to them, you know, you need to be part of this community consistently in some way so we know who you are, but we want you to be free to be who you are. And what does that mean in the classroom? And what literature do we need to find? In addition to the printed word, of course, we had experience. And Mary Potter named that. And that was one of the most exciting things that I encountered, is that this was a school that said right up front, experience is really a good thing. And we value it, and you bring your experience. I had done my dissertation at a school that when people on the doctoral dissertation committee found out I was writing my dissertation on Letty Russell and had visited and stayed with her in her home, they weren't sure I could be critical enough any longer to do my dissertation on her. At which point I looked at these men and said, could I introduce you to some feminist literature that talks about the importance of relationship and connection and experience? And that's what I found here. The other thing, as we talked about it, we went and asked the dean to each year consider hiring a faculty person to teach in women's studies who didn't look and sound like the women who were already on the faculty. And then we said, Susan Draper White lectures. And if you look at this list on the back, you see the invitation of women very intentionally that didn't look like the women who were already on the faculty. So that was an incredibly important part of the pedagogy here that permeated the whole school. So the broad understanding of learner-centered, which I can say feminist work for the classroom, for all kinds of presentations, included student engagement, understanding of the material that followed the feminist values of relationality, of personal agency, self-identity, experience, and contextual analysis. So I think that's where I'll stop with that, except I just want to lift up Mary Potter named Themes and Experience. I often talk about the work of a theological process is very similar to what I've just described, feminist hermeneutic developed by Katie Cannon and Letty Russell, that Letty and I had long discussions that it was the perfect way to teach a subject because it was a good theological process, and that taught me a lot.
Thank you. As I have listened to each and thought a bit about the larger social landscape in theological education, I'm just amazed at how far ahead United was early on. Head of Princeton, head of Yale. It might not surprise you, ahead of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Yes, are probably Trinity Evangelical as well, Mr. Dean. Groundbreaking work was going on here, way ahead. And Clyde, people are rising up and calling you blessed this evening, and that makes me happy that you were so supportive of this. I can imagine there were pockets of resistance. There usually are with students or other faculty members who might have felt threatened about this. Or do we only have good stories, or was there a little resistance to this wave of feminist theology here?
I'm going to name one because I was stunned because it came from women and men on the faculty. When Martha Postlewaite and I were developing courses in nurturing your spiritual life as a religious leader, and we had created a course around that topic. And it was initially rejected by the curriculum committee because it wasn't academic enough. It was too experiential. And I looked at Rich Weiss, who was dean at the time, and said, I don't understand. The assignments are very academic. And he looked at me and said, I know, it's just people get worried when it sounds like you're going to evaluate how people pray. And that got Martha and I really moving in what we did in those courses of how do we help people think about that, so that as pastors and chaplains, when they were holding somebody's hand and needed to help them pray, they could take the experience that we were giving them and translate that into their ministry. But that was a really interesting, because it was experience-based, where we got held up. Eventually, it was all accepted, but it was an interesting experience for us.
Yeah. Carolyn, were you going to speak to that?
My own experience, and I don't want to go into this too deeply, I haven't really processed it enough to do so, but is towards the end of my career, and not with Kyle, and certainly not with Molly Marshall. I never had the joy of working here when you were president, Molly. But there was a resistance to some of the work I was doing. There was a kind of been there, done that. There was a sense that women's studies was appropriate for the 90s, but surely in the aughts and the teens, we don't need it anymore. I was reading last night, the Pew Research Center has just come out with their study of the gender gap. And unfortunately, by gender, they mean men and women. There's nothing about gender fluid people in it. But that from 82 to 2002, the gap in pay was increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller, and that it's been frozen since 2002. In 2002, women, all races, all gender orientations, whatever, made 80 cents on the dollar. In 2022, 82 cents. I think we still have a problem. Our right to reproductive freedom, persons with wombs, and most of us self-identify as women, though certainly not all, that has come under attack. I think we have a problem. I think that this is why Mary's emphasis on it can be forgotten quickly has been so important to me, is because there is a temptation when we have so many more freedoms than we had when I was a little girl, or even when I was in college and asked my professors to include women in the books on courses on American novels, and I was told there were no novels written by American women. I mean, really? Zora Neale Hurston doesn't exist? You know, we have so much more awareness now, but there is always a need for, what shall I say, vigilance, and for ever increasing sophistication on how we do women's studies. I think the need is still there. Now, the theoretical tools, I think, are also there, but I think that we'll have to, if there's a women's studies program going forward, which I think there needs to be, I think the tools have to be highlighted that talk about the social construction of gender and the danger of dualistic views of gender. Okay, I've gotten way off topic, but yes, there was resistance, but it was mostly that of a kind of induced apathy because we've done that. It's accomplished here.
Well said. Well said. Thank you. And you covered something that I was going to move to after a bit. Yeah, Mary.
Just one little comment. We went through a period, I think it was in the late 80s, when there were more and more women students. Maybe 2/3 of the student body was women and going up a little bit. And there were worries. I think it was the board that was worried that this was going to become a women's seminary. And
An
that would-
ovarium.
Yeah, that would really be not a good thing. And, conversations at faculty meetings when Ben Griffin would report this, and he was under pressure, were, let us say, intense. He and I got in a little tiff one time. I mean, his heart was certainly in the right place, but he was reporting what was happening with the board. Too many women, not a good thing. And there's a whole line of thinking in American religious history that related to declension theory. When any institution becomes too feminized, it's going down the drain. It's losing its power. It's not a good thing. And I'm not going to go on about how we like men students or any of that, but you can imagine it was just a moment in history and there were worries.
Thanks.
It then became the worry that would be the queer seminary. All right.
Folks, find us. Truly. I'm going to just do a little brief interlude because we could talk a long time about the Reimagining Conference. You all know that in 1993, a major theological conference was held right here in the Twin Cities, and leadership sits at this table and in this room. Dr. Nikisha Mabrock, back here, wave, Rita, yes, Dr. Lundblad, and others here.
Mary Kay Sauter.
Yes. Which was a phenomenal kind of rethinking of imagery for God, of the role of women in leadership, of the kind of ritual that would be more inclusive than it had been. And so the folk who helped make that happen and suffered some of the repercussions for having done so sit at this table, and we are all in their debt. Now I want us just to move ahead just a little bit. And Jessica, I want to turn to you now. And we've been talking about the influence of feminist theology, but we know that there are many other ways in which the concerns of women theologically have been expressed. And so what are the significant conversation partners that womanist theology has brought to this study?
First, I want to say hello, and thank you for the opportunity to be sitting here amongst such giants in women's studies here at United. I was thinking about the womanist theological conversation partners with feminist theology. I reflected on the various waves of womanism and some of the ways that those waves have integrated with the waves of feminism. And I'm thinking about the first wave of womanism Katie Cannon, Renita Weems, Jacqueline Grant, Dolores Williams, Emily Towns, and then thinking about the second wave, Karen B. Montagno, Stacey Floyd Thomas, Monica Coleman. And I think what many of these womanist theologians did was stake their claim in gender studies in a lot of ways, and stake their claim in thinking about what it means to be a Black woman in theological education, in theological spaces. And what I want to also name is that oftentimes womanism seems to be categorized as an offshoot of feminism or of the Black liberation theological movement. But really it grew in and of itself. It grew particularly out of Katie Cannon's work, out of Renita Ream's work. And so I think womanist theology has become a very robust conversation partner with feminist theology. How I see that manifesting itself here at United is through the welcoming and the invitation of women thinkers, women theologians, women scholars in these conversations around social transformation, in these conversations around what does it look like to be a thriving institution and to produce thriving students and thriving ministers based on their gleaning of womanist theology as well as feminist theology. I think we do that integration very, very well here because of the historical integration that's happened.
That's encouraging.
Carolyn, tell us what happened when you and Alika began to teach together and bringing differing perspectives to it.
Magic. I've never had a classroom that was, we did it twice. And by the way, there was some resistance to doing it a second time. That was something that was resisted. And Cindy Beth Johnson was one who went to the mat for me for that, for which I'm infinitely grateful. But what happened was I had the joy of going to my doctoral program when Renita Weems was a student and Clarissa Martin was a professor. And they influenced me a lot to realize, wait a minute, my bibliographies are all white. That's not okay. And Clarice in particular helped me with my bibliography for my first feminist hermeneutics class. But then I realized that I was defining the issues and finding women of color to fit into the issues that I thought were feminist issues. Well, no, that's the white woman's, middle-class white woman's agenda. That doesn't work either. So then I started having, looking at Mujerista theology, Mujerista interpreters of the Hagar-Sarah story, womanist interpreters, Native American interpreters, going down and trying very hard to make white somewhere towards the end, but in the middle so that it wasn't the final word or the first word. But I realized as long as I'm the teacher, and by golly, I'm still white, it was going to be white-centered no matter what bibliography I had. And there's an inevitability of that. But I decided, no, if I'm going to teach with integrity, interpretation of as resistance, it has to be with an African-American woman. And Alika said she thought it was me that made the class seem like magic. And I said, oh, no, honey. We're really good friends and had been for 12 years. And that, we built the course. It wouldn't have worked had we not been really good friends for a really long time and worked together at Northside Healing Space. Because there were times when my queerness and her not queerness clashed, or when her blackness and my whiteness, my white ignorance clashed. But our friendship saw us through, and it was absolutely transformative for both me and for the students, I believe. They've told me that anyway. So that's what happened.
That's wonderful. Jennifer, when we think about where we are in this next wave of thinking in feminism, womanism, et cetera, we have to begin to think about intersectionality and the way the various identities a person brings then shapes what one is doing in theological construction. How do you reflect on that?
I really like that the medievalist is being asked to think about the future. I think that's very appropriate, actually, and I can make a historical argument in favor of this line of inquiry. Yeah, so when we're talking about intersectionality, and specifically a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s, and in that context, concerned with anti-discrimination laws and the intersecting identities of Black women. That's obviously expanded a lot over the years, and if you're not familiar, you can find her article very easily, the original one, and also she has an amazing TED Talk on it if you want something that's not specific for somebody who has a law degree. So we can talk about, for our kind of purposes and what I strive to do in my teaching, and for me in particular, I teach art history classes and arts praxis classes and historical theology. The ways that, so we can think of intersectionality as this framework for understanding and addressing the ways that various social identities, so this is things like gender and race, class, immigration status, ability, and so on, intersect, basically to result in a unique lived experience of, in this case, we're mostly concerned with oppression, but the kind of flip side of that is then also privilege. And so rather than thinking about identity as, somebody's various identities as the sum, this kind of additive experience, rather to recognize that our identities are intersectional and thus dynamic. And so we all experience oppression and privilege to varying degrees in different contexts. For me as a historian, I think that's important because so much of, when theological history has been concerned with certain identities in its telling, namely white European Christian men. And that's not to say that folks of other identities didn't exist. This is also why the arts are important, because then our resources are not limited to textual sources, when in the pre-modern world most Christians were illiterate. Okay, I won't go on about that. But it'll turn into a commercial for the arts if you give me a second. But cultivating an intersectional awareness or methodology is significant whether you're in theology or ethics or history or what have you, because we can, I think, be more attuned to looking for these identities and experiences of folks who've been marginalized historically. And this is imperative, of course, because lives are at stake right now today for those very reasons. And so there's, I think, restorative work that can be done. To Mary B's point about, these, think of like Hildegard of Bingen and the recipes for abortificants that she records in one of her medicinal manuals. And I think, unfortunately, it's the case that women had more bodily autonomy when it came to reproductive rights in the Middle Ages than they did in the 19th century. So if you want to hear more about that, I'm happy to tell you more about that as well.
I think your time is
okay,
up.
all right,
Yes.
that's fine. I could talk about United too.
Well, I want to flip it back to Jessica. It seems to me that womanism has pioneered in intersectionality much more than feminist theology. You want to say a word to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think womanism has pioneered kind of a method of framing, respecting, acknowledging, recognizing intersectionality at play amongst different communities and groups. I think your naming intersectionality made me think about another thing I wanted to note around womanism is also the recognition of Black feminists. And so kind of thinking of the intersectionality of Black women in and of ourselves, right? So not all of us are women, some of us are Black feminists too. And I think part of the third wave is really bringing forth the recognition that we don't have to be either or, we could be both. And I think that that's a really interesting additional conversation with white feminists. What does it mean to be a Black feminist, and also holding on to your womanist theological perspectives? But I think that's another piece of intersectionality, being it personal.
Thank you. I think of the work of Dolores Williams at the Reimagining Conference and the ways in which she, out of her experience, wanted to overturn even the categories with which one talked about suffering, the death of Christ, etc., born out of her lived experience. We could go on and on with the wonder that is assembled at this table, but you might want to ask a question. And so we have someone who will bring you the mic if you would like to ask a question or offer an observation as to what you've heard.
I'm Louise Forsyth, and I came to United two reasons. One, it was calling, but it was a middle life change. And what I found when I came here, which is what I was worried about, is I was going to be surrounded by 22-year-old men. And where were the 35 and 45-year-old women? Because I was 40 or 42. Well, I just turned out to be about right in the middle of everybody's age. And also, we're a majority of the sex. So I sat there and went, this is weird. And then when I had to write out the application of why I wanted to come to United, I said, I want to find out if there's a God. And I thought for sure they'd reject me. Because who wouldn't, you know? And they didn't. And I came in. And through the glorious teaching and interaction and the ability to say those words that were so sinful to say in a community of faith, I found my way. And it was just a joyous experience, and I'm so deeply grateful from every cell of my body that I got into United and spent some time here and had my babies here. My first 6 weeks at United, I gave birth to my third child, nursed him through New Testament.
We ought to make a commercial of that, a place to have your babies. That's great. Who else?
Going to United Theological Seminary was a high point in my life. I just loved it. And I'm a person who grew up a preacher's kid, so there was all kinds of stuff that I'd grown up with. But coming here, I found answers to questions that I hadn't had before. And I really appreciate it. And it's interesting that some of the things I remember from an Old Testament class you taught, the story of Hagar, Abraham, and Sarah. And you had us read a male theologian, a Jewish theologian, a female, and a womanist theologian. And having each of them take that one story and view it from their own perspective. The male theologian said, oh, poor Abraham, having to put up with these two women. And the Jewish woman said, oh, poor Sarah. She's caught in a system that's oppressing her and not working for her at all. And the womanist theologian said, this isn't any different than the slavery days that we had in this country. And so it was just getting that perspective that I had over and over again in your classes, theology classes, Christian ed. It was all absolutely wonderful. So thank you all very much.
I was wondering, for Jessica and Jennifer, if you think womanism and feminist theology is integrated in the whole curriculum, or if you do think there needs to be like a department, or like that question that they were talking about earlier. I'm curious as to what you both think.
Good luck. Yeah. It would be called Medieval Women's Studies. I I think it's a both and. I think it's a classic United both and, because you can never have too much of it. And I think that one of United's great strengths, past and present, is having things like women and gender studies incorporated throughout the curriculum. I think that the good thing about that is students are incorporating it in all, or are experiencing it, hopefully, in all classes, and not as something that is being marginalized by way of being treated in only one specific class. I think our current core curriculum design is also really strong in that. And for example, that all students have to take an arts class. But I think that there's certainly advantages to also having it incorporated. So this is something that's come up in recent, in recent times amongst the faculty of whether we should, because we have, this wonderful endowed lecture, and so then what is that? How is that reflected in the curriculum? I think that one thing that, sorry, I'm going too long. This is my last thing I'll say, Molly. I think that the advantage of having, say, a women's and gender studies program, or whatever you would call something like that, would be that we could focus especially on theory and give a more robust kind of background to that. I think when students encounter it in little bits and snippets in classes, it doesn't give enough of the kind of depth that is beneficial. So that would be mine.
I don't think we're equipped to have that central to our curriculum yet, but I see hope. I think with including more women on faculty might propel that into the integration.
There's a question in the chat asking if there are any good reading lists available from womanist theologians. I don't know if that's for a specific person or not.
Yeah, the list is way too long. Way too long. What was mentioned about the Hagar text, Dolores Williams, I think is a great starting point. Katie Candon is a phenomenal starting point. It's kind of up to you if you want to go ethics or kind of biblical scholarship, but a great Google search, I think, would reap a lot of.
Or you could take Black and Womanist Theologies at United.
By Dr. Gary Green.
Well, I have another question that I would like each of you all to respond to briefly.
There was a question.
Was there one? Did I miss? Yeah, Jacques.
I'm curious. Hi, my name is Jacques. I'm a current student at United. I really loved the question that President Molly Marshall asked earlier about some of the not so good times, especially after and following everyone's beautiful retellings of your history. And it sounded so beautiful here, and it feels really great to sit in this room with all of you. I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on spaces outside of United and sort of how that impacted your scholarship after leaving a cultural place like this that was so rich as you've described, and if you had different experiences in different institutions with more resistance or sort of more negative feedback, and just kind of how that affected your own work as educators and scholars.
Yeah, because you've had.
I'm going to take a little different tact and let others pick up on it. But I taught the senior integrative seminar for 24 years and made it my baby, and did everything from what's your ecclesiology to here's my CPA to teach you how to do clergy taxes. We were very practical. But one of the core things that I did in pieces, and it became bigger pieces over the years, was I would ask early, very early, first or second class, tell me the different topics that have become important to you while you're here as you think about who you are now. And of course it would be inclusive language, image of God, what is the church, how do I do ministry in settings different than I know, all this kind of stuff. And I would let them just keep generating this list, and then I'd say, okay, everybody write it down. Now for the next 5 minutes, I want you to, in the next column, write down what you believed about those topics before you came to seminary. You know, what was your image of God? Santa Claus on a good day. You know, I mean, you know, now, what is your image of God? I don't know yet, or a woman I want to know, or whatever. But 5 minutes, 5 minutes. And then I would say to them, okay, so the church that raised you up, or the church that your denomination may be excited you could pastor, is probably in column number 2. And how you're describing yourself now is column number 3. How can you pastor a person you used to be? And that was the rest of the term that we would play around with ecclesiology in a variety of ways. How do we do ritual? Where do we find different kinds of resources? I can't imagine ever using male language for God again. I'm sure your district superintendent is going to put you in central Iowa, and that church is going to use male language for God. So not that you never do it again, but how do you meet them where they are? And I think that whole opportunity to intentionally think about why you're asking the question you're asking is to start to think about what resources did we have, what resources do we have now, and then where might other resources be is the direction that you're taking us. Helps, I think, maybe the school as well as your colleagues start to think. I will tell you, through some very unhappy days at United Seminary out in New Brighton, I basically was forced to leave after 24 years and left United Seminary 7 years before I thought I would retire. But God had a better idea, and I became a full-time transitional pastor. And the people that graduated that year were really delighted to know after teaching for 24 years, I was going to be allowed to be in the church full-time as a pastor. But then I spent the next 8 years thinking, oh, I wish I would have taught that differently, you know, because now I was doing it full-time. So I think there's that sense of continually asking the questions. Who did I used to be? Who do I want to be? How do I get there? And then realize, but who am I in relationship with? And where are they in those columns of my life? So that's a little different way to get at, I think.
Molly, I'd like to. I'd like to answer Jacques' question. 2 points that are actually really important to me, and I don't want this history to be lost. I came from 2, as I said, patriarchal, paternalistic, flagship denominational seminaries that were Bardian. And when I came to, this is the important thing, because Bardian theology is indifferent at best to culture, all aspects of culture, what's happening in society and culture, and you do theology, you know, apart from that. And in the Tillichian model, I'm not a Tillichian, but United had a culture of Tillich in terms of, and Tillich always talked about the boundary of theology and culture. So, and you go in both directions, from theology to culture and culture to theology, or to religion and culture. And he had a method of critical correlation, which, you know, is it's not the best method, obviously, but it does take culture and it does take society seriously. And that means, and that's what I found at United, and I still find so inspiring, is that whether it was Wilson Yates doing theology and the arts, whether it was Harold Davis doing Native American culture and theology, whether it was Mary Bednarowski doing new religions, you know, and, you know, religion, Or, we were doing women in culture, what was happening in the sexual, the protests against sexual violence and so forth. All that was very important. And that could only happen in a place that had that kind of seminary, smaller culture. The other thing I want to say is that I don't want to get lost, is that for me, affected me profoundly in my work every day since I've left United, is the exposure I had to Native American theologians and students when I was at United. That was in society, this was a time of red power. Native Americans had occupied Alcatraz, Wounded Knee was in 73, Pine Ridge and Leonard Peltier was in 75. There were posters for Leonard Peltier in our chapel. Vine Deloria, God is Red, spoke in the chapel several times. That all was a very, very important learning, for me, and it still affects me to this day. So I just wanted to say that I don't want that part of our history. The Native American Theological Association is no longer present or in operation, but it really had a profound effect on communities across the Midwest during those times, and certainly on me and the kind of sources I used and the experiences that I was open to and the way I thought about the world. So thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond to Jacques' question?
Most of us retired from here.
Rita does.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm going to come in an indirect way to it. It seemed to me that at the time that reimagining happened at United, there was no place else in the country it could have happened. Partly because of the number of women faculty and that history into the 90s, but also the relationship to local clergy women and to local churches. That, there was Sally Hill and others. And so there was this energy and number of feminists in the church and in the seminary that it was like critical mass is what I would call it. And there were plenty of places that had prestigious feminists, but often they were beleaguered in those places, and the kind of energy that United uncorked, I think, by not resisting that energy was part of why something as amazing as reimagining could have happened here and nowhere else. And so my question is, now, everything is online. Mainline churches have been in decline for several decades and are closing and dying. And so the question I have is, what next what is the energy that you are seeing, or where is this going to go next? Because I think United, by its personality and location, has these strange opportunities to do things out of the box, right? That could ignite something new. So that's my question.
Are you pitching me a softball there?
No,
Dr. Broad?
no. I actually am
Well,
curious.
here's where I think
No,
the energy...
I'm moving to the Twin Cities, so I'm curious.
Yes. Well, I think the energy is in several places, but I'll mention two. I think environmental justice is captivating so many of our students, and they're bringing their whole selves to that. I also think interreligious engagement is capturing how we think, how we teach, how we cultivate respect for the lived religion of others. And I think we are pushing that boundary. Both saying it is an expression of progressive Christianity to do that, but also saying theological education does not require the kind of confessional parameters that once it did, and that there's a very healthy learning context in which people bring their whole selves to that. And I think this is a capacious place to be theologically adventurous, as Dr. Wheeler and I have been talking, and to explore and push those boundaries and actually construct some new theological insights. And so I think that's where we are. It's not the information everybody needs to master in order to have the imprimatur. It is what is the thinking that is fresh and that interrogates simplisms and certitude in a very, very challenging and I want to say the right word, and too many are clashing in my head right now. This is a very fecund time, I think, theologically, for us to think about how it is that we live in a religiously plural context with joy and receptivity and the kind of porous boundaries that allow us to learn well together. That's what I think's going on. And with that wonderful conclusion, I think we should call the evening to a close. But let me say, the school would not be what it is without these forebearers, these thought leaders, these courageous folk who broke new ground, who gave good scholarship, leadership, and actually shaped an ethos here that is radically inclusive and I think expresses the best of what theological education should be about. So thank you all for your presence tonight and for what you have offered to us all.
I know you're so busy, so I'll let you choose the calendar. I'm retired. That would be wonderful. Are you doing okay here?
Yes, this
It was fun. I wanted to say, okay, don't anybody leave. Well, wait a minute, I'll be right back. Something, I'm 70. Life is different when you're 70.